Welcome to the Spirituality What? Podcast, where we explore the mysteries, joys, and challenges of being spiritual beings navigating our unpredictable human experience we call life here on planet Earth. I'm your friendly guide, Rebecca, ready to jump into our adventure of the day. Welcome back, everybody. This is Rebecca. This is the Spirituality What? Podcast. It's Wednesday. It's time for another episode. This week, we are going to be talking about mental health and spirituality with a new friend of mine, Dr. Deb Mahan. She is the executive director of the Gazette Charities Foundation, which is an affiliate of the Anschutz Foundation serving El Paso and Teller counties in Colorado. She's been in Colorado Springs for about 30 years and served on many boards and many commissions. She spent a lot of time both in the nonprofit and business sectors throughout her career and loves how the two come together and have influenced her work in philanthropy. With a background in neuropsychology, she also convenes the Colorado Mental Health Consortium, a group of 50 individuals statewide advocating for mental health and behavioral legislation. I met Deb at a charity luncheon for We Fortify, which is a local charity in Colorado Springs. She gave the keynote, and I was actually moved to tears during a luncheon, taking a break from work, and she talked a lot about her spiritual and religious background and where that brought her, and really just resonated a lot with what I thought we brought on this podcast and the accessibility and the diverse backgrounds of the people that I've been interviewing here. So I went up to Deb after the luncheon and just said, introduced myself and said, hey, have this podcast. What do you think? And the rest is history. So Deb joins us today to talk a little bit about her path to neuropsychology and her overall curiosity around human behavior. We talk a little bit more about the big T and the little t traumas, which we first started talking about with Natty in our jujitsu episode. We talk about the amazing Gabor Maté, her special technique, the pause, the breath, and the noticing, and mental health as an endemic human experience. We also talk about some of her personal experiences with mental health and control as a response to trauma. This is a really intense episode. It's really interesting. Dr. Deb knows a lot of really cool stuff, and I'm really excited to share this with you today. So let's just dive right in. All right, everybody, we are back with a new episode, and today I am here with my new friend, Deb. So Deb, if you would introduce yourself.
Yeah, Deborahsmahan. I'm the executive director of Gazette Charities Foundation, which is a Southern Colorado affiliate of the Anschutz Foundation. And my background is neuropsychology and specialized in trauma, and my interest in well-being for all is sort of the number one passion in my life. Yeah.
Well, we are really excited to have Deb as part of this episode on mental health today. So just like with every other interviewee for this podcast, we're going to start with the main question, which is, what does spirituality mean to you?
Yeah. Well, spirituality for me is at its very core just the idea of a sense of or a belief in something greater than the self. So something bigger than me. Something that is more than just the human physical sort of sensory experience that I'm having. And it's a sense of sort of that I'm part of a universal story that's unfolding. I'm part of the divine whole, and that I have a universal purpose to my life. That's sort of, it's a lot of words, but it's what really basically spirituality defines itself in a lot of different ways in my life, but that's what it means. It's sort of that sense of something or a belief in something, someone greater than me.
Yeah. Outside of yourself.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Well, we are going to jump in today on our topic of mental and behavioral health. And so I think to give us a start, if you could talk a little bit about how you got into neuropsychology and sort of your experience from a professional and maybe even a personal perspective.
Yeah, it's interesting because I chose it as a field, obviously very young in college, because I was just really intrigued by and curious about human behavior and kind of what makes us tick and what's the relationship between how we think and how we behave. And at that point in time in my life, I would not have had anything that I would describe as trauma. Now, with many decades of reflection and looking back at my childhood, there actually is some trauma in my childhood, but at the time I thought I'd had sort of the perfect childhood.
Oh, you were just perfect.
Upbringing. Yeah, I mean, I kind of don't like that word, but it sort of felt like it was idyllic. I mean, a really idyllic childhood, happy home, happy family, loving parents, And so it wasn't like I chose it as a field to heal anything on the conscious level. Clearly, there probably was something on the unconscious level. The interesting thing is that very shortly after choosing it as a field of study, the universe decided to hand me a practicum. And
it was like, you open that gate, we're ready to go.
Yeah, 3 years of practicum. So there have been many, many, many losses, like what is considered in the profession complicated grief. Lots of complicated grief, complicated loss, complicated trauma in the last 3 decades of my life. And so I've gotten to experience it and learn through it and integrate it into my whole person in a way that has taught me an awful lot about it. And for me personally, spirituality has been a crucial part of that. I mean, I can't divorce healing from trauma and a journey toward wholeness apart from spirituality. For me, they're very integrated.
Yeah, I think I agree with that too. And I think going back to when you were saying you had this perfect child, you thought you did. You thought you did. Yeah. You thought you did.
Yeah.
I think that, and we've talked about in other episodes before, like little T trauma and big T trauma, that like everybody has trauma.
Yes. Yeah.
It might just be little T versus big T, and I guess does complicated trauma associate with big T trauma? Is that
it does in a lot of ways. I mean, kind of. Some of the definitions, the difference is that big T trauma is kind of a mind-body adaptation to a specific hurtful, injurious event.
Okay.
Whereas small T trauma is kind of an injury to the authentic self.
Okay.
So something internally where we've sort of divorced ourselves from our internal self, whether it's somebody said something mean to us or we believe something.
Oh, okay.
Like
whereas
a criticism big T trauma is more of a major injurious event.
Yeah.
And then what we do with that inside of ourselves. And I love, I know a lot of people right now are aware of Gabor Maté's work, and he has a beautiful quote that is, trauma is not what happens to us, but what happens inside of us in response to what happens to us. But long before Gabor said it, and I adore Gabor Maté, but long before he said it, there was a Stoic philosopher, Epicurus, who had an even better way of saying it, which was, I have it right here, if I can find it. We are disturbed not by events, but by the view which we take of them.
Our perspective, our interpretation.
It's what we do in our minds with what happens to us that is so injurious, really, to our psyches.
Yeah.
And that's where all trauma comes from. And so for me, that's why I can't separate mental health and well-being from spirituality, because we are spiritual beings. And so if the wounds that occur to us become greater, become more injurious, because of how we think about them, that's where the spirituality piece, because it's about how we then move ourselves out of that myopic view of ourself and what's happening to us to a greater view of the context of something greater than us that allows us the space for healing to occur.
Would you say that this extra critical part of ourselves that gives us little T trauma is ego?
It is ego. Yeah, it's the narrative. It's that, ego is a great, word for it that everybody understands, but it's really that internal voice. It's the observer in us, right? It's that part of us that tells us a story about everything we're experiencing in life. And it's constantly going, and it speaks at unbelievably vast volumes of words a day about what's happening to us. And it's where we become fractured from our authentic self based on something that happens, and then what we say to ourselves about what happens.
Story that we tell ourselves.
The story that we tell ourselves.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So we're saying here that our authentic self, we as a whole spiritual human incarnation have an experience. And our authentic self is able to observe the experience for what it is, but our ego, our more maybe human part of our spiritual beings is kind of what attaches onto and creates additional problems or additional narratives or additional meaning where maybe there kind of wasn't.
It gets caught up in the mind. And various spiritual practices have various names for it, but Buddhism talks about the monkey mind, right? It's that part of ourselves, that narrative of our mind that will not stop creating a story about whatever is happening. And so spiritual practices are so important to stopping that, because universally, regardless of tradition, regardless of the religion, all spiritual practices have a component to them that is about stopping, that is about pausing, breathing, and noticing. Those are the three words that are so crucial to me to any spiritual practice. It's about a pause, the breath, and noticing. And the noticing allows us to remove ourselves from the mind as an observer so that we can then create the story we want to tell ourselves in that moment.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So how does maybe a lack of mental health impact spirituality then?
Yeah, I think when we are caught up in the narrative of our depression, our anxiety, our separation, it so separates us from others, when we're in that place of a mental health issue. Yeah, it's very, very isolating. It's difficult for us then to be loving, to be generous. I mean, spiritual practices are comprising of generosity, of love, kindness, of compassion.
Yeah.
And so when I'm completely absorbed in what's happening to me, it's hard to then engage in those kinds of things. Now, the flip side of that is that if I will shift into engaging in those kinds of things, compassion, love.
If you can get yourself
Yes,
there,
if you can get yourself, care for someone else, it flips the story on what you're experiencing around depression, anxiety. So there's this amazing back and forth interplay of how spirituality and mental health affect one another, in terms of spiritual practices affecting your mental health and your mental health affecting your ability to engage in your spiritual being.
Oh yeah. That is really interesting. And I think let's also clarify. I think it's worth just acknowledging here that like everyone probably has some kind of mental issue, especially in the where we are in the current day and age, after COVID. Like there's we all, you might not be bipolar, and have some more sort of serious mental health considerations, but there are other things as well. Like we all talk down to ourselves sometimes, and it can be situational, of course, as well. But
it's almost impossible in this day and age. What we understand now, and I think COVID really helped this because it brought words like trauma and our mental health into the universal zeitgeist, like we all talk about it now. But the reality is that it's always been an endemic human experience. It just is. And I love what the psychiatrist Mark Epstein says, which is it's hard to imagine the scope of an individual life without envisioning some kind of trauma. And it's hard for most people to know what to do about it. So that's where spirituality comes in, is in that place where healing must begin, the knowing what to do about it, because we are spiritual beings. We're spiritual beings having a physical experience. Not physical beings having a spiritual experience.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I would love it if you could talk a little bit about your personal experience with mental health and spirituality in your personal life.
Yeah. So like I mentioned, very shortly on the heels of that decision to go into psychology and neuropsychological studies, I lost both my parents in a car accident.
Big T trauma.
Yeah. Big T trauma. Like floor disappearing from underneath you. Yeah. I mean, completely bottom dropping out from me. And as I said, in this relatively idyllic childhood, I mean, I was very close to my parents, loved them even as a young adult. They were two of my best friends. They were the people I respected most in the world. Had my incredibly funny Irish father and just incredibly delightful and magical, enchanting mother, and still feel that way about both of them. So it was a huge loss in my life. And for me, it brought everything into question, because I was raised in a tradition, a spiritual tradition of, in my home, it was a belief in one God and a Judeo-Christian, relationship with God through Christ, that kind of thing. And so because that was my spiritual practice was in the context of a Christian belief system, it brought a lot into question. When you're taught your whole life that God is benevolent and loving toward you,
you're
and
like,
is there for you and cares for you. That's exactly where I was in
exactly. Like, why would this happen?
How could this happen? And how could you do it to them? And how could you let it happen? And how could you let it happen to my siblings? And I, all this young, we were all under 30. I mean, all very young. And it really rocked my world. And the interesting thing about it was that at the time I was working in ministry in a church. So I was
that is
every day
yeah.
in a context working in trauma work within the church context in an environment where it was difficult for me to question all of this and throw it out the window.
Mm-hmm.
And I had a lot of friends at the time say to me, are you afraid you're going to become an atheist through this? And you know, the interesting thing is my response was always no. It's so core to my being that there is something greater than me. That was never in question. Yeah. The question was, do I want to have anything to do with him anymore?
Got it. Yep.
And that took a long time to come to resolution. Did I want to have anything to do with him anymore or not?
Yeah.
Given my experience that it wasn't all roses, you know.
Right.
It was there. Shit happened.
Right.
And it happened big and it happened bad.
Absolutely.
And we felt alone. I felt alone in the world, and that was going to be part of my reality. And so it took a long time to answer the question of did I want to have anything to do with him, but it was never a question of was there something bigger than me in the universe.
Right.
Never. Yeah.
That's interesting that it was so kind of fundamental to you that, I mean, my beliefs are basically kind of everything happens for a reason, right? Mm-hmm. Like there's, you know, there's karma, there's learning, there's growing. There was something that had to happen in your life. You know, it seems like when you talk about in hindsight, sort of this happening the minute that you were like, oh yeah, I want to work with big T trauma. The universe was like, oh, well, you better get some. Yeah. In order to really hit home here, you better have some of that in your life.
Yeah. Yeah. And in fact, it did for me, you know, kick off some mental health issues that manifested in me and a lot of anxiety because, you know, when there's that kind of a wound to your nervous system, very often what the next response is the desire to control, right? To clamp down and the need to control things. Because if this kind of big T trauma can happen, then the universe is so chaotic and bad things happen so much that I've got to basically hang on somewhere, right? Because what has happened, the shock to your system is so great. And in my case, it became a great deal of anxiety about my other family members and losing anybody else and anything bad happening to anybody that I loved. And then that control flipped in me, and because I had been a dancer for years and you know, athletic, and it manifested in some really serious exercise anxiety. So the control for me became,
I got to exercise.
I will work out 6 hours a day.
That's the thing that I can control.
That's the only thing I can control. Yep. And it wasn't so much an issue with food for me as it was literally working out 6 hours a day. Yeah.
Interesting.
And so my journey since that point in time in life has been this letting go of control and embracing the unknown and embracing chaos and understanding that, again, it's the breath. It's the pause and the breath and the notice, right? In that space, I am safe. And that goes back to the messaging inside yourself. It's this sense of even reminding yourself on a regular basis, even though chaotic things happen, I am safe and I'm strong and I'm capable and I have agency and the world will be okay. And, you know, all of those kinds of things become powerful messages inside of us that move us forward further down the road. Yeah. That was not the end of my lost story, though. For
no, sure. It definitely wasn't. It definitely wasn't. So, okay, I'm thinking about control now.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking about if that's just a natural reaction for everybody.
To the wound, your nervous system.
Yep. Okay. Interesting. I feel like I have been accused as being controlling in the past, and I think that, you know, it's an interesting concept to try to understand from a personal perspective, control, especially because you might not always know where it comes from, and it doesn't feel like I want to control things. Like, I don't feel like that's what you're thinking. You're not thinking, I want to control exercising, for example. You're just like, I'm just going to do this because it helps me feel better.
Exactly. And, you know, the reason it helps you feel better is because the wound, which is basically just, that's the Greek word for trauma, is wound, right?
Okay.
And, or the Greek word trauma is for wound.
Okay.
It's the word for wounding or piercing, which I think it's interesting because what it pierces is the authentic self. But when that occurs, it's an impairment of the integration of your nervous system, right? And so when that happens, that chaotic feeling, that chaos, the response to that is rigidity.
That makes sense.
So that rigidity is what the control ends up looking like. Sorry, move the puppy. The rigidity is that ability to control. And the reason it feels good is because it takes you out of the present moment. When chaos occurs or trauma occurs, the dangerous place feels like the present moment, right? Because this is what I'm feeling right now. Right. So I have to get out of this present moment. Yeah. And so control is an avoidance of that present moment, because control always flips you into either the future or the past. I'm either controlling the people around me, or controlling the story or the narrative of what happened to me, or I'm controlling what might happen in the future by trying to clamp down. I'm controlling you so that you don't do anything to possibly hurt me. That's always a future response, right? So that kind of control does feel good, because in that moment, it's everything but just feeling what I'm feeling right now. In the breath, in the pause, in this noticing. Yep. Yeah.
It's an avoidance tactic.
It is. It absolutely is.
Like, okay.
And unfortunately, it's the hallmark of dysfunction in all interpersonal relationships. Control is.
Interesting.
Because
But it's never about the other person. It's always about you.
Exactly. Yeah. That's the thing, is that the reason there's dysfunction in our interpersonal relationships is because we're trying to control. And in an effort to control, we can't just see that person for who they are. I've actually got a great story about this. So when I was little, my brother and I were very close in age, close playmates, close everything. And I was inside the house one day. He came home from playing outside. I was in the kitchen with my mother. He came around to the back door of the house, and I came down the landing to open the door. He came up the driveway screaming, is what got my attention. He came up the driveway, absolutely screaming. He's like 5 years old at this time. Came up the driveway screaming, and I came down, and when I saw him at the back door through the screen, he was covered from head to toe in mud. And so I start, as the big sister, not that much bigger, barely older than him, but start screaming at him, "What did you do? What did you do? You're filthy. What's wrong with you?" All these, injunctions on him. And as I'm opening the door, I realize he's not covered from head to toe in mud. He's covered from head to toe in blood. He had a huge gash at the bottom of his chin and was just covered. My mother comes racing in. She immediately, of course, mothering, grabs him, takes him, puts his head under the sink, starts nurturing him, gets him medicine, takes care of, are we going to take him to the emergency room, get him stitches, et cetera, et cetera. Care, nurturance, what he needed in the moment. And the lesson that's been for me for decades since then as an adult is that sense of when we are in control, when we're trying to be in control in our relationships, we look at everyone through that screen. And so what we see in them is mud. We see dirt. We see their flaws. We see what they've done wrong. And when we see that in them, we separate ourselves with him. I kept saying to him, "Stay outside. Don't come in. You're filthy. You have to stay out there." My mother saw the blood. She wasn't looking through the screen. She saw through the eyes of a mother, and she immediately saw blood, saw a wound, saw a need to care for him, a need to give him love, a need to give him what he needed in the moment. And if we could work in our lives to remove those screens from the way that we look at each other, we'd see the wound in each other and want to give nurturance and want to give care instead of seeing the dirt in each other and the mud and want to separate from each other.
Yeah. So how do we do that?
Well, I think that's where our spiritual practice comes. I think the removing the screens in life and allowing ourselves to see people from a real vantage point, from an authentic vantage point, and accept them takes the pause and the breath and the noticing. It takes us being present with ourselves enough that we're not walking around with a screen in front of us trying to protect ourselves all the time. Yeah. And that's going to take a journey inside. It's going to take us looking at our own wounds and looking at our own knee-jerk reactions to those wounds, our own responses.
Right. It's about awareness.
It is all about awareness.
Because it
is all about awareness. That's why mindfulness is so powerful as a spiritual practice.
So define mindfulness. I feel like we might have talked about it before on the podcast, but maybe not.
Yeah, so mindfulness for me is that exquisite presence to this moment. That's what mindfulness is. And it can look like lots of different practices. It can look like meditation. It can look like breath work. It can even be a part of yoga. It's really about that exquisite presence to this moment. And it's really, really powerful. There's phenomenal neuropsychological research that shows that in the practice of mindfulness, the neocortex, the cortex of the brain, actually grows. There is more gray matter. There are more synapses. Wow. So it's a powerful, powerful spiritual practice that actually affects our neurology, affects our nervous system,
physical
our actual brain. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
I took a mindfulness course at work. So I want to say this was like right during COVID when we were all kind of working remote, and they offered an 8-week mindfulness course. And one of our exercises was to spend like something like 5 or 6 minutes eating a raisin.
Yeah.
So first we had to smell it for like a minute.
Yep.
And then we had to touch it and feel it for a minute and really pay attention. You know, so there were all these senses. And then we had to put it by our ear and we had to hear it. And then we had to put it on our tongue, but not actually eat it, you know. And it was so interesting. It was so slow, but at the same time, it was such an interesting, like, I don't know if I really knew what a raisin smelled like.
Yeah.
Prior to that, actually, honestly.
There is a smell.
But yeah, they totally have a smell, but it was a very, very enlightening activity because I'm not a huge fan of raisins either. Mm-hmm. But I was like, this isn't too bad. But what I did was take that activity and applied it to some other foods in my life. Mm-hmm. And I realized that some of the foods that I was eating, I really hated.
Yep.
One of the best examples was gummy worms. Specifically because I had those on my desk that day. And I did that, and I was like, I don't even like the way these taste. Yeah. Like, I've just been mindlessly...
We do. We mindlessly put all kinds of things in our mouths. Yeah. Mindful eating is a huge practice. It's a really huge practice. And most people are very uncomfortable with it the first time they try to do it. Because we want to eat quickly. We want to just get it all in, right? And the thought of slowing down and smelling, like you said, using all your senses, seeing it, it's a really powerful practice. I also tell people a lot when I'm speaking about mindful walking. And I say, just go for a walk and do these 5 things. If you want to do mindful walking, look for, and actually notice them and say them in your head, in your mind. 5 things that you see, 4 things that you hear, 3 things that you smell, 2 things that you can taste or touch. You can do either one, and 1 thing that you can taste. 2 things that you can touch and 1 thing that you can taste. On a walk, and actually become aware of those. That's a way to bring your mind and body, your whole nervous system, to this present moment.
I've actually heard of
just
that
noticing
as like a mental health technique too. Like
it is
in crisis moments.
Yep.
That people can use that. It's like not necessarily a walk, but even just where you are, just to bring not really ground yourself, but it's bring yourself back somehow.
It's your awareness. Yeah. Which is, again, that mind, which has already gone off on a train about all these ideas and all these narratives and all these stories that have you in a hole. So the second you engage in an awareness practice, you've now recaptured that mind, that beautiful instrument that is, in my opinion, co-creators with God. I mean, it's so powerful how we create with our mind. We literally make reality. Yes. We completely make reality with our mind. And to have skills and abilities through practices, spiritual practices, to recapture that for a moment is, I think, the tool to well-being and mental health. I really do.
So you talked a little bit about mindfulness in general. I love the idea of mindful walking. I think that I love being out. It's also really nice right now in Colorado. It's a really great, it's a beautiful day. But being outside in general, for me, I feel like just helps. So that the act of just being outside, I feel like makes it a little bit easier to be mindful, and aware, mostly, but also when you're walking, like you're not usually trying to be on your phone, and I feel like phones are like the worst thing for mindfulness.
They are
and presence,
because you're just being thrown content, like your garbage is just being thrown at you. You don't have to be aware of anything.
Right? Yeah, it's just completely mindless. Yeah. I really like that. So, and then you've also talked a couple of times about the pause, the breath.
And noticing.
Yeah. So are you referring specifically to breath work or just conscious breathing?
It's just being aware of your breath. Yeah, most of us aren't ever in a given day even aware of the fact that we're breathing because it's such an autonomic response, right? So the pause, you have to pause from whatever you're doing long enough to then notice my breath. Well, that is the noticings, right? So they're all cyclical as well. The pause, notice, breath, they're all interwoven with one another. But I think that's the most simple spiritual practice anybody can have. If you can just pull that off, you are engaged in a spiritual practice in the moment, whether you know it or not. It doesn't have to have religion attached to it. It doesn't have to have any ideology or any concept attached to it. It's just because we are spiritual beings. Right. Yeah.
And that's what we talk about on this podcast, right? Is like the accessibility of spirituality. And I think so far, this is the most accessible practice that we've discussed. And just this taking a moment to step back from where you are. And of course, it takes practice.
It does take practice.
It's hard.
Yeah.
It's hard work. You're triggered. You've got trauma. Yeah. But being able to take that moment.
And that is a wrap for today. Thank you all for joining this episode with Dr. Deb and I. Join us next week for part 2 of this episode. And don't forget to tell all your friends about this podcast. Have a good one. Thank you for joining me on today's Spirituality What? Adventure. Subscribe, rate, review, and share this podcast. Visit us on Instagram at spirituality.what to interact, tell us what spirituality means to you, and even provide some of your own personal musings. Human on, you phenomenal spiritual beings.